wanted to give a disclaimer that I'm going to be talking about depression today in this sermon. I am in the process of getting my master's in counseling, but I am not a licensed counselor. If you are feeling hopeless or like you need help, please reach out to a licensed professional in your area. There are a lot of resources available for you. Please know that you are loved and you are not alone. So hey everybody, before I start, just want to say hi. Thank you for joining me. My name is Julie Moore. I'm currently getting my master's in counseling from a seminary, so I'm really excited to dive into this topic with you this morning. So right now we are finally getting to the end of 2020. Thank you, sweet baby Jesus, am I right? It feels like it's been at least 5 years since COVID really hit us hard in March. I know that for me, if I'm being completely honest, this year has really sucked. I've been hurt this year, I've been disappointed, and I've been heartbroken. And I think it's safe to say that I am not the only one. Many of us have dealt with losses big and small, from the loss of loved ones to the loss of milestones and life events. And we're still dealing with them. And I know that at least for me, this year has taken a huge toll on my mental health. Today I want to have a conversation about depression. I know that a lot of people that I have talked to have felt like depression has not been addressed within the church. There's a tendency to push negative emotions like sadness or hopelessness out of the church and chalk it up to a lack of faith. As someone who is studying counseling as well as the Bible, I think that the church needs to be at the front lines of having hard conversations about difficult subjects such as mental health. As we enter into Advent season, the focus this week is on hope. My desire for this sermon is to start a conversation within Christian circles about depression, as well as encourage you to hold out for hope. In the Psalms, we see King David. He's defined as a man after God's own heart, and he is struggling with depression. I'm not sure about you, but I know that I feel oddly comforted that somebody so esteemed by God also struggles with depression. And we can see his struggle clearly in Psalms 42. Verse 1 says this: "As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God." When I hear this verse at first, I think of that old hymn, "As the deer panteth for the water." It's a sweet and beautiful song. If you haven't heard it yet, you can pause this and look it up on YouTube. But it evokes these images of like a dainty little deer lazily lapping up water from a waterfall. Maybe there's a rainbow in the background with some butterflies. But this is not what this verse is talking about. James Burton Kaufman writes in his commentary on this verse. This is what he says: "This metaphor compares the heart hunger of the psalmist to the physical pangs of a deer suffering from acute thirst, running from place to place seeking water in the dry season." This is not a deer who's drinking water just for kicks. This is a life or death situation. Without water, this deer will die of thirst. Exhausted and spiritually dehydrated, David defines the need for God to be close and present with him as a case of life or death. And maybe you've felt like this, or maybe you've known someone who's felt like this. When stuck in the depths of depression, things seem hopeless. Whether or not you felt like that, whether or not you felt that spiritual dehydration or that dry season, or like things are a matter of life and death, even if you've never felt like that, I think we can all agree that we all want hope. When I began thinking and praying about preaching on depression, I reached out on Instagram just to kind of get a feel for where other people were. I wanted to know if other people felt like I did, if they wanted a deeper discussion in the church or if I was alone with this. I decided to ask people what they thought about depression in the church. For the majority of people, they heard and were taught that depression is typically seen as a bad thing or seen as a lack of faith. And I want to tell you this morning that depression is normal. Going to therapy is normal. Taking medication for your mental health is normal. You are not a bad person if you do any of these things. You are not a bad Christian if you do any of these things. Someone mentioned specifically that it would be helpful to hear more church leadership talk openly about their struggles and how God was faithful through them. I had been on the fence about being vulnerable in this message, but that person's text, it decided it for me. And I want to just say this at the beginning. The reason that I'm sharing this is because I've been there. I've struggled with depression, and I know a lot of people don't understand it. I want to share with you this morning because if you are struggling, you are not alone. I want to share with you this morning because if you don't understand depression, I want to help you cultivate that understanding. And again, I want to share my story because I want you to hold out for hope. In July, I had a baby, and about 2 months ago, I was diagnosed with postpartum depression. It has been incredibly painful, and it's been incredibly difficult. And I've carried a lot of shame of shoulds, like I should be enjoying my baby more. I should be better. I should be okay without medication, which at this point I'm not. I've been on medication for about 2 months. I've struggled with feeling like if my relationship with God was better, I wouldn't be hurting so much. At the worst point of my depression, it was impossible to see past the day I was in. It was all I could do to just make it through the day. And I explained it to my husband. Hopefully this metaphor will make sense. You know, like in magic shows where they have this big glass box that they lock their assistant in, and you know, it fills up with water, and the trick is like the assistant gets out. I told my husband that I felt like I was locked in one of those big glass boxes full of water, but I couldn't get out. I felt like I was watching everything from the outside, just slightly separated, and like that water was getting higher and higher, and I couldn't get out. The first time that I felt like I was getting out of that glass cage was one day when I was at work. I had this sudden epiphany that I was going to experience Christmas with my baby girl this year. I had been so stuck in every single day that the truth of this hadn't occurred to me until we were in October and my baby was 3 months old. It took me months to realize that I had hope for something that was guaranteed, that I had hope that Christmas would come. I've learned that being in the middle of the pandemic with lack of social support and the anxiety that comes with COVID, women who have given birth are 600 times more likely to suffer from postpartum depression. I kind of feel like I hit the jackpot for like best times to have a baby. I don't know the statistics of depression as a whole, but I think we can all agree that this year has been painfully difficult. Studies show that around 17.3 million American adults are affected by depression, and this is not taking COVID into consideration. I feel very confident to say that that number is much higher now. And I'm going to say something now that might make you mad, but I'm going to ask you to track with me for at least the next 2 minutes. At the root of depression is sin. Now, if you are like me, you're probably bristling You're probably wishing I was preaching in person so you could boo me or maybe punch me in the face. But hear me out. There are two different kinds of sin. There is personal sin, and there is the state of sin. Personal sin is obviously our personal choices and decisions that go against God. But the state of sin is something beyond us. We are all born into a broken and ugly world. And this is so important to distinguish. So many times I've heard stories of depression being pinned on personal sin. If you are struggling with depression right now, I want you to hear this and I want you to throw this in the face of shame. If you don't struggle, I want you to listen and go forward with empathy and compassion. Depression is a chemical imbalance. Depression is not a choice. Depression is not as simple as choosing to be happy. Depression has a root of sin, the state of sin. Depression is a result of a broken and hurting world. You are not a bad person if you struggle with depression. You are not a subpar Christian. Taking medication for depression does not make you weak or bad. You having depression does not mean that you have a bad relationship with God. You are a person deeply beloved by the Creator who has been affected by the sinful state of the world. And my sweet brothers and sisters, you are not alone. Depression is normal. How many times have you heard somebody in the church say that before? As I mentioned, so many people are affected by depression. Depression can even come on after stressful life events. A study showed that almost a third of heart attack survivors went on to struggle with depression. Life events can affect our mental wellness, such as a pandemic. As Christians, we should be diving headfirst into conversations about difficult emotions. As ambassadors of hope, we should be talking about how to give hope to a hurting world. We should be leading the march towards wellness, healing, and hope. This first week of Advent is centered all around hope. Wherever you are, if you're struggling with depression, or if you're hoping to foster more empathetic response or connections, hope does have a place. Hope is not painting silver linings or saying at least, which we're going to talk about more in our love sermon. Hope doesn't take away from real and valid hurts. Without watering one or the other down, hope and hardship can both exist in our lives. Though it can be difficult to see in the moment, hope and depression can coexist. We see this dichotomy of seemingly conflicting truths in the book of Jeremiah. The book of Jeremiah is written by the prophet of the same name, and it tells the story of the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians and the following exile of the Israelites. A very wise friend of mine, Amy, brought this example when I was asking about depression. And she pointed out Jeremiah 31:2, which says this: "The people who survived the sword found grace in the wilderness." All right, so we're going to hold up for a second. Survived the sword. I feel like sometimes when I read the Bible, I can kind of skim over shocking statements like this because I think, well, it was a different time, whatever, surviving the sword. But I'm going to say that again, the people who survived the sword. Amy pointed this out to me, and she mentioned the trauma that would go along with surviving an attack from the Babylonians, as well as the resulting exile. Surviving the sword, surviving trauma or hardship, which we all have this year, is difficult. And no matter what happens afterwards, it's still hard. It doesn't take away that hurt. When Amy mentioned this instance, it reminded me of another story from Genesis. One of my favorite stories in the Bible is the story of Joseph. And Joseph had an absolutely horrible life. He was thrown in a pit for dead by his jealous older brothers. Then they sold him into slavery. Despite being a person of integrity, Joseph was accused of rape and then thrown into prison. When he helped someone out who was in that prison, that person forgot about him for years. Between the time that Joseph was sold at 17 and was released from prison at the age of 30, 13 years passed. Some scholars think that Joseph was in prison for up to 12 years. When that man that Joseph helped finally remembered him 12 years later, Joseph was finally promoted to helping Pharaoh. Because of Joseph's help, many people were saved from a famine that could have wiped them all out. Nearing the end of the story, Joseph's brothers come to Joseph, since he's the guy who has the food. After a while of misleading his brothers, he told them who he was. His brothers apologized, and this is how Joseph responds in Genesis 50:20. He says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is being done now, the saving of many lives." Within both of these passages, we see horrible things happen. We see Israel losing their homes, and Israel losing their stability because of the Babylonian attack. Joseph has lost 13 years of his life because of his brother's jealousy, and yet they found grace in the wilderness. God intended it for good. Amy also said this to me, which I thought was a beautiful reminder. She said, "There is grace in the wilderness, but it doesn't mean that the wilderness isn't hard." I think that sometimes we can forget that the grace in the wilderness can coexist. Depression and hope can coexist. Struggling with the truth that life is hard, life is excruciating, that doesn't mean that you don't love God. That doesn't mean that you're a bad Christian. One quote I saw a friend share is by Francis Ward Weller, and I think it encapsulates this thought beautifully. I'm going to read it now. "The work of the mature person is to carry grief in one hand and gratitude in the other, and to be stretched by them. How much sorrow can I hold? That's how much gratitude I can give. If I only carry grief, I'll bend towards cynicism and despair. If I have only gratitude, I'll become saccharine and won't develop much compassion for other people's suffering. Grief keeps the heart fluid and soft, which makes compassion possible." God is able to make beauty from the ashes. He's able to bring hope from hurt. This, however, does not take away the evil. It does not take away the evil, but it does bring meaning to it. Your emotions are valid. Your struggle is real. Nothing can erase it, but in time, God can give meaning to it. As I continue to go through the wilderness of depression, I'm finally beginning to see more hope. I'm currently going to counseling as well as taking medication. These are tools that God has given me that help me and that I thank Him for every day. As I began praying for this sermon series, I could feel myself getting excited, and I realized something. Even though I don't know how this will go, I don't know if anybody's going to listen to this, and at that point, I wasn't even sure if I would follow through and actually do a sermon series. I started to feel hope. It took me 3 months into depression, again with the help of medication and counseling, to see hope for something that I knew would come, Christmas, with my baby. And it's taken me a couple more months to see hope for something that I'm not sure of. It took me a while to see that grace in the wilderness. And I know for me, I'm still in the middle of that exile, but I can see hope just a little more clearly now. I remember hearing a sermon once during Christmas about hope in the waiting. Hope when that wilderness is just too real and too dark. Isaiah is a book in the Old Testament where the prophet of the same name foretells the coming Savior, Jesus. And this book wasn't written, and these prophecies weren't heard just a couple months or even just a couple years before Jesus came into the picture. This book was written 700 years before Jesus came on the scene. And there were generations of people who lived and died who heard this promise and never saw the fulfillment. But God still fulfilled it. God still kept his promise. Whether we can see hope or not, hope is still there. And I want to end this morning by reading Jeremiah 31, 2 through 4 to you. I was trying to think of an eloquent or beautiful way to wrap this up, trying to tie in that struggle between depression and hope. But I realized that Jeremiah already wrote it many years ago. Jeremiah 31, 2 through 4. The people who survived the sword found grace in the wilderness. The Lord appeared to me from ages past, saying, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore, with loving kindness, I have drawn you and continued my faithfulness to you. Again, I will rebuild you, and you will be rebuilt, O Israel. You will again be adorned with tambourines and timbrels, and you will go out to the dances of those who celebrate. The wilderness will end, and God's promises will endure. But while you're there,